Greetings and welcome. Today we want to talk about the 1918 to 2020, the different pandemics that we have faced. We're going to be talking about from the Spanish flu till today. And the reason being is that right now there are a lot of comparisons being made with COVID-19, or SARS-CoV-2 is the scientific name, and the 1918 Spanish flu. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to have some perspective. We would like to be able to understand these things through the eyes of history, because as it so often is, history doesn't always repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide here. Now, just to be clear, I am a chiropractor licensed in the United States, and one of my passions is to study pandemics and virology and vaccines and all these things. The other thing is I'm also a committed Christian, and I believe that the Word of God has a knowledge for us, and I believe that this passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 1:9 is key to understanding everything that we're facing. And it says this, it says, "The thing that hath been, it, that which shall be, and that which is done, that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun." Now, whatever your perspective is, I hope that by the time we're done with this presentation, you will have a new appreciation for just how true that text tends to ring. So here we go. We're going to begin with the Spanish flu. We can look at the next slide. And now let's look at some clippings from the newspapers. These are the newspapers in the United States, and what you'll see is all the fear. And again, the Spanish flu, there was a lot of reasons to be afraid. We believe that millions of people lost their lives during the Spanish flu, and there were many deaths attributed to it. And it was a time that many people were terrified of what was going on. And you can see some of the lines, you can see some of the headlines in here. There's a look at the advertisement in the middle: coughs and sneezes spread diseases. It was a way of telling people to wear masks. I didn't include it in this presentation, but there was even a story in the United States where a man was shot by a police officer for refusing to wear a mask. That tells you the hysteria that there was regarding the Spanish flu. But we need to understand just how the people died and why they died. There's no doubt that the Spanish flu was dangerous in and of itself, but sometimes we need to look at how things were done in the past and see if there's something we can learn about how the Spanish flu was managed as in comparison to today. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide. This is from the Indiana State Medical Journal, and I want you to read one of their observations. If you look carefully, this was published in 1918, and this is what they say. "During the epidemic of pneumonia last year, the barracks were filled with soldiers standing about the stoves, coughing and sneezing. In some barracks, the noise was so great that it was impossible to hear ordinary conversation. The air of the barracks was thus saturated with virulent nose and throat organisms. The whole solution then to the problem of prevention of disease transmitted by way of respiratory tract is the proper technique of face mask. No vaccine will prevent the present epidemic of streptococcal pneumonia. And for the streptococcal group of bacteria change their offensive and defensive power so rapidly that the vaccine prepared today against the predominating organisms will be powerless against the predominating organisms of tomorrow." It's fascinating that they're talking about just how unsanitary the conditions were. They packed everyone into these military barracks. For those who don't know, the Spanish flu originally broke out in military barracks in the United States. This was during World War I, so during the military campaigns in Europe, this was also where the Spanish flu broke out. The reason why it's called the Spanish flu is that all the nations who were fighting at the time did not report the outbreak of the flu, and the only nation to do it was Spain, because they were neutral. They did not have a dog in the fight. And so when they reported it, people said, well, that was the Spanish flu, but truthfully, everyone was facing it. And because of the unsanitary conditions in the barracks, many people did die. And notice the doctors at this time believed that no vaccine could possibly work, and they thought the offending organism was streptococci bacterium. They thought that that's what caused it. Now, when they say pneumonia, you have to understand there were two phases of the Spanish flu. There was the acute phase where you had the regular flu symptoms, and then it would transition to a bacterial pneumonia. The weakening of the immune system, the translocation of bacteria would eventually get in the lungs, make you sick, and that's what would finish you off. Sort of like with SARS-CoV-2, it's not necessarily the SARS that kills you. It's the acute respiratory distress syndrome where you have a massive cytokine storm and the lungs fill with fluid and they become fibrotic just because of all the increased interleukins and inflammation in there, eventually leading to inoperable lungs and suffocation and eventually death. And that's the greatest fear. If we go back to the slide, you find that it says this, and I like this, the second box towards the bottom. If we go back one slide, and we look at, it says this, serums and vaccines and influenza. Unfortunately, we as yet have no specific serum for the cure of influenza and no specific vaccine or vaccines for its prevention. The various treatments now being tried are experimental, and their value will not be known until all the results are collected, which probably will not be until the epidemic is over. As to serum treatment, the only noteworthy and new method so far is an injection in severe cases of influenza pneumonia of serum patients who have recovered from such pneumonia. Now, this is interesting because today, when we talk about SARS-CoV-2, we talk about, well, maybe we'll use plasma, and that's the only effective, or at least what the media seems to want to talk about. Vaccines, maybe some plasma, maybe some high-end retroviral, antiviral drug. That's what we think will work. And the doctors, just as many are, or at least in the mainstream media, many are confused about what to do. These doctors at this time in 1918 were completely confused what to do. Let's go on to the next slide. But they did have some treatments that they did try, and you can see this. It says this. Well, this is actually, he's going to get to what they're going to do treat, but this is what he says. In the future, we will look back on this epidemic of influenza and pneumonia with wonder and surprise. In spite of our vaunted advancement in medicine, we have utterly failed in the present crisis. This epidemic is going to continue until every susceptible person has been infected, just as there have been no physicians. The cause of the present failure of the medical profession is ignorance of its preventative medicine. Our medical schools have taught diagnosis and treatment, but not prevention of disease. Now, this is fascinating because this could be said today. While we talk about vaccines as preventative, there's very little emphasis in helping people to eat well. I shouldn't say that. There is emphasis, but it is not mainstream. Yes, there is the Institute for Preventative Medicine. Yes, there are doctors around the world who emphasize diet, nutrition, and things like that. But where in the media are we talking about taking selenium as a preventative? Where are we talking about taking prophylactic vitamin C or ginseng or licorice root? Things that you find in the medical literature, it's not there. What we steer everyone to are vaccines, plasma, expensive antivirals. And it is interesting that just as the doctors had no answer for the Spanish flu, we hear this all the time that doctors have no answer for this, which is kind of interesting. I will say that the death toll from the Spanish flu is going to dwarf SARS-CoV-2. There's going to be no comparison. But the state of fear and the lack of answers to many of these questions makes things very similar. Let's go to the next one. Now, this is fascinating. They couldn't find anything that was working. And this is in the New York Medical Journal. And you can see this is September 21st, 1918. And in this editorial, they're talking about the epidemic of influenza. And they say, where you see the red line, it says, quarantine seems impractical and ineffective. This is the reason why they said that, is that even when they tried it, people still got sick. It is interesting to note that in countries that had some of the severest lockdowns in the world from SARS-CoV-2, the disease still spread. And in the United States, for example, in New York, which had one of the most severest lockdowns, has the highest amount of deaths and the highest amount of cases, which is kind of interesting. Italy, the same. So similar to this, quarantine didn't seem to work, and they kind of did quarantine the way that we did it today. What most people don't understand is that if you take quarantine from the biblical evidence or from Moses, what you find is that you don't find them quarantine a city where one leper is. They quarantine the leper away from the city. But today we're quarantining people without any evidence of them getting sick. Now people can say, well, we didn't know how to diagnose this or anything like that. But if people didn't have symptoms, we were still quarantining them. Anyways, as we look at the slide, we go back to the same slide we were on. Notice what they say. After they say that the quarantine seems to be ineffective, the very next line, the most effective prophylactic seems to be sunshine and fresh air. In camps, they are assured by mushrooming the tents except during rain and in prevention of crowding, but no system of prophylaxis seems to be effective in preventing the spread of disease so far. This is fascinating. He goes on, he then says this, he says, the treatment usually given includes rest, Dover's powder, quinine, and aspirin. So let's break this down. First, they couldn't find anything to treat the soldiers, and so what they did is they put them in tents, they let them get some sunlight, and they said, these guys are getting better. They did give people a little bit of quinine, which then gets into the whole hydroxychloroquine, which is a derivative of what we use as quinine. It gets into the whole sort of debate that they were using that to actually treat the Spanish flu. Now, I'm not sure how effective it was. I imagine that it did reduce some of the inflammation and probably prevented some of the major cytokine storms. But they also used something like Dover's powder. So Dover's powder was a combination of Ipupac, which makes you throw up, and opium. So I don't know how that could have helped anyone. Maybe it alleviated some of the pain and maybe helped you sleep, but that was just poisoning the system. Aspirin is a two-edged sword. On one hand, it's going to reduce inflammation. On the other hand, it's also going to reduce your body's ability to fight disease. So they didn't know what to do. So quinine, opium, Ipupac, and aspirin, that's what they were using, but they found the most effective was sunlight and fresh air. And mind you, these aren't alternative medical practitioners. These are doctors who are committed to drugs, committed to vaccines, committed to standard medicine as we would recognize it. And they have an open mind and they're finding some of this alternative stuff is working. Let's go to the next one. Now, what you find here is you're going to find more of how they were treating this disease. And so he says this, and he says the treatment is purely symptomatic, and no general order has been issued regarding it. Each surgeon or each medical service following its own ideas regarding the treatment. The administration of aspirin, salprin, and other salicylic compounds is routine treatment. Where cough and pneumonia develops, they are treated symptomatically. We'll go to the red line, and he says this, a study of a number of fatal cases of influenza as well as several cases of dying of other conditions showed that the sinuses were infected in almost every case harboring the influenza organisms. Now, I have to stop there. They didn't know about viruses or they could not see them at that time. So they presumed what they found in the nose was actually the disease, but it wasn't. And notice what they said. Such infections were also demonstrated in living patients by the application of cocaine, epinephrine, into the interior of the nose, which led to drainage of pus of one or more sinuses. So they were using salicylic compounds, which is where we get aspirin, and they were using that, suppressing the immune system, and then giving cocaine and epinephrine, which is what we normally use to treat people when they have an allergic reaction. We give them the EpiPen so they don't swell up and their throats closes up and everything. They had no idea. And yet all along they're saying, well, this is the organism. This is what we're going to do. They had no idea. And as you can see, this isn't just something made up. This is medicine, surgery in the Army and Navy. This is, again, standard medical literature. So this is fascinating that without answers, they were still doing this. And the organism that they thought was infectious just so happened to be in the nose. It actually wasn't the offending organism because they couldn't see it at the time. So we look at this and we have to think to ourselves, how many of these deaths were actually attributed to the influenza itself or the way they were treating it? If you're giving people cocaine, if you're giving them epinephrine, if you're giving them opium, if you're giving them Ibupac, how in the world are they supposed to make it out of this? I do believe people were more robust then, but still, that's pretty amazing. Let's go to the next slide and we'll see what else they were giving. This is pretty impressive. So there's two ways that they treated this. Again, this is from the New York Medical Journal. This is again in 1918. You can see the date, October 26th at the bottom. What you find is that there's two ways of treating. They had the internal and the external. So they say the local treatment of what they would put on the chest and things like that. Some of that isn't so bad. The iodine, the cinnamon, the thymol, the eucalyptus oil, camphor menthol, and petroleum, that probably wouldn't be so bad. You put that a rub on the chest and they breathe that in. Of course, they would also put it through the nose. That could be a little irritating, but it wasn't devastating. And if it was done the right way, it would probably help with a little drainage. But the one that would kill you is the next one, which is the internal and treatment. And this is what they say. They were giving you belladonna. Belladonna is something that we currently use to help people who've been poisoned with pesticides. It is a hardcore drug. They also used quinine. They also used opium, camphor, which isn't too bad, and they were also using bone set, which you see, which is also known as symphytum officinale, or I forget the name. It's symphytum officinale, which we would say is it's bone set. There's another comfrey. There it is. It's also known as comfrey. So still, giving people large doses of this isn't going to get them better. It's going to make them more sick. Now, we can forgive them for not knowing about the organism. We can forgive them for sort of experimenting around with all this. But notice that their predisposition was to drug someone into health. And what they found is that they gave this, it wasn't working, which led them to do the open air tents and the fresh air and sunlight, because they were killing their patients. We have to put an asterisk next to all the deaths from the influenza and say, wait, possibly it was the way that they were treating them, not necessarily in the fact that they had the disease. Let's go to the next one. Now, eventually, they develop a vaccine. Now, mind you, they thought that the vaccine was bacterial based. They thought that they identified the offending organism. And if you look at the newspaper article, this is what it says. It says right here, we'll look at right at the red line. It says this. It says, statements made at the meeting covering the use of vaccines at the cantonments, that means the camps that they had, in other cities where the epidemic has raged, were far from satisfactory to the physicians, and it was determined to continue to recommend the gauze mask as the most reliable preventative. It's interesting. So people needed to still keep wearing the mask even though they were getting the vaccine. Why? Because the vaccine wasn't working. He goes on. He says, he goes on, and we'll go to the second red line. He says, cases where the vaccine had been applied locally under the best possible conditions were recited. In each instance, influenza developed, it was said. So not only did they give people the vaccine, but it turned out that they were causing influenza. They were making people sick. Now, probably what happened is they gave someone a bacterial vaccine and it took over and it caused all the same symptoms of influenza or weakened the immune system so that when influenza came in, they got it, which is kind of crazy to think that that's what they were doing. Let's go on to the next one. And this is from a physician writing in the newspaper in January 14th, 1919. And this is what he says, and we'll go to the first red line. And this is he's not on board with this, but it is interesting. You can see this idea about the flu vaccine. He says, Colonel Victor C. Vaughn of the Surgeon General's office states that in the Army cantonments, vaccines have been tried with the greatest thoroughness. Notice the assurance that vaccines are working. Vaccines are well used and experimented. We know what we're doing. And notice what happens. And it has done not one bit of good. Dr. E.C. Rosenau of Rochester, Minnesota, holds that properly prepared bacterial vaccine confers considerable protection for a period of at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks? That's all you can get? Anyways, especially when administered to expectant mothers who have a feeble resistance when ill with the flu, whatever the flu may be. I love this. I love this because you wouldn't have this type of candor today. These doctors admitted they didn't know what they were doing, but they had so much trust in the vaccine, they were willing to give it to pregnant women for 6 weeks of possible immunity. Meanwhile, the Surgeon General of the military says, hey, this isn't doing any good whatsoever. And they still believe that they have the right bacterium that they're fighting, that they're doing a good job, that they're saving lives, and yet they can't win everyone over because they're failing. And he says, the doctor writes in at the very last paragraph, he says, there is reason to suspect that the germs mentioned are only accessories to the real offender. He's right on target, more right than he knows, which perhaps is some ultramicroscopic virus. But here's the thing. Had they not been so committed to drugs and vaccines, they could have been saving lives by using things like hydrotherapy, like using sunlight, fresh air, all these things which we now consider so minimal in our scientific age, and yet there's plenty of evidence to suggest that these things could work even today. Let's go on to the next one. Again, now this article is written by a medical doctor in the Journal of Social Progress in November 1919. And this medical doctor, she writes in and she talks about how they were treating this. And she goes on to show some serious drugs here. And we'll just look at, we've talked about the ones, most of them, but I'm just going to highlight a few. So she has two columns, drugs used in influenza and drugs used in pneumonia. And you have to understand that they thought that these were two phases of the same sickness. So she says aspirin, which we talked about, and quinine we talked about, and Dover's powder we had mentioned, opium and Icupac. But then she mentions strychnine. Strychnine is what we use as rat poisoning. She was saying that they were using strychnine and calomel, which is another poison. They were using that to actually treat the Spanish flu. If you were taking rat poison and calomel, which is mercury, how in the world could you get better? You could see why the doctors didn't even know what to do. And then we go over to the other side. We go to drugs used in pneumonia. So again, mercury, calomel, alcohol. I'm not even sure what exactly that was. Was it isopropyl? We don't know. Strychnine again. So if rat poison didn't work under the influenza, then rat poison might work under pneumonia. That shows you they had no idea. Atropine, which we talked about, which is an antidote to pesticides, but it is very toxic. Nitroglycerin, which is something we use today to open up the arteries in people who are suffering from angina pectoris or chest pain. Ammonium, which is another poison, which we use. Actually, the meat packing plants use it to treat meat because they don't have sometimes very good antibiotics anymore. Digitalis, which comes from the plant foxglove, which is a substance which we use as digoxin, and that is actually a cardiotonic, and that is also very toxic as well. And then of course the final one, extract of Genetian sulfonal. Trional. This is something that they use to treat fungal infections and things like that. Not something you ever want to ingest. Again, if you lived through the first round of treatment under the influenza, you were probably finished off in the pneumonia treatment. So you look at this, they thought they were so committed to a vaccine and a drug that they were literally killing people. They were wiping them out. And you have to think about this today. Are we as a society so focused in a narrow window of therapeutics? We need a vaccine. We need a drug. We need a vaccine. We need a drug. Otherwise, we can't get back to normal. That we're actually poisoning ourselves, or that we're actually signing on for something even worse that we don't even know yet. See, this is why it's important to learn from history. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, this is interesting. Now, notice what she says here. I love what she says, because this could be said today. And this is what she says about the Spanish flu. Notice what she says, red line. She says this: fear, worry, and panic are the flu's allies. Could it be that today, with the fear, worry, and panic that we have, that this is an ally for people to actually get sick and experience SARS-CoV symptoms, or to lower their immune system to make it? But she goes on. She goes, fear, worry, and panic are the flu's allies. These pests have little respect for age, station, or sex, but they do represent respect the community of individuals who refuse to weaken the system or to lower the vitality by wrong methods of living, and for thereby the propaganda of the three allies is prevented from attaining a foothold. Now this is fascinating because she's quite right that when we actually don't give in to fear, when we actually stand and say, let's try other things and not panic, that we're not lowering our immune system. And she's talking about, hey, the flu, when your body's in an optimal condition, can't harm you. She goes on. She says, be an optimist. Now, mind you, she's saying this, just to reiterate, she's saying this about something that killed millions of people around the world. Millions and millions of people died because of this. And she's saying, one of the first things you need to do is not to panic. I actually read another article where another physician was saying the same thing, saying, hey, one of the worst things you can do is to panic over this. And that panic has actually made the influenza worse than it could have been. Think about how many people have freaked out over this and have over SARS-CoV-2 and have destroyed their immune system, have made themselves depressed and miserable, have failed to visit family, have avoided social gatherings with people that would have made them feel better or at least changed their perspective on life. How many people in isolation with SARS-CoV-2 have turned to alcohol and drugs and made shipwrecks of their life, never being sick? I have a feeling that when we look at the analysis at the end of this year of how many suicides we have, we'll find a spike in them, particularly in the months of lockdown. That's awful. That shouldn't happen, but this is what happens when we have a pandemic laced with fear. Anyway, she goes on. She says, be an optimist. Be alert. Be an alert optimist, however. Play safe. Don't neglect the small beginnings. Remember the parable of the tiny acorn. It is from the neglected, cold, and overtaxed system that influenza, while there is no occasion to become panicky over a cold, chill, or pain, that no matter where located, is nature's method of notifying that there is something wrong, that you are below par. Do not neglect the warning. As a first aid, when you feel a cold coming on, miss a meal or two. It won't hurt you. Don't eat or drink anything except a glass of unsweetened lemonade or orangeade. Don't take drugs or serum. In a recent article by Professor Michael A. Lane, experimental pathologist, says, in all the infections due to bacteria, and these constitute the vast majority of infections, drugs are not only useless, but positively dangerous and to be avoided at all costs. They can have but one effect, and that is to make the patient by suppressing the natural reactions an easier prey to bacterial and their toxins. It's just fascinating because she's very clear. She's like, look, be safe. Don't go crazy. If your body feels sick, go lay down, take a rest, even fast, and drink lemon water with lemon, not lemonade with tons of sugar, or orange and water. Build yourself up. Don't overdo it. This is what's her advice. And this was something, again, she faced. She lived through it. She saw the bodies. She read daily in the newspapers the death count, and this is what she would say in the face of that. That's pretty impressive, to believe that the Spanish flu could be fought by simply avoiding drugs, by drinking water with lemon, by drinking water with orange, by resting, by fasting. That's pretty interesting. She goes on in the next slide. She says this. She says, to repeat then, don't take drugs for a cold. Give nature an opportunity to recover her normal tone. Manipulation, Swedish movements, massage, chiropractic, osteopathic manipulation. That's what she means by manipulation. Hydrotherapy and rest will aid her. In times of epidemic, or at times when you experience a suddenly rise of body temperature, in addition to missing a meal, go to bed. Call your doctor. So think about that. She says all disease is the result of disobedience to nature's laws. This is an interesting perspective because she believes that diseases are always all around us, but they need to find a host where the defenses are weakened. If we build our bodies up by hydrotherapy, constitutional hydrotherapy, contrast hydrotherapy, all these different things, manipulation, massage, relaxation, stretching, osteopathic manipulation, chiropractic manipulation, Swedish movements. All these things can boost the immune system to help prevent sickness. Fascinating that a medical doctor who lived through it would say that. But again, let's look a little bit closely at this hydrotherapy, because there were other people who actually used it and were successful. Let's go to the next slide. So this is from an article called the North Union Reaper, and this was published, and it says seminary clinches the flu, and this was published in 1919. And so notice what they say here. Okay, they're going to talk about how a number in the area where this seminary was located, there was an outbreak of the Spanish flu, and people were getting sick. And these young men and women and the teaching staff were trained in hydrotherapy. This was something that Seventh-day Adventists taught and believed in. Seventh-day Adventists in 1862 started to develop what they believed a Christian health message, where they emphasized a vegetarian diet. They emphasized rejecting drugs, using water such as hydrotherapy, sunlight, rest, trusting in God, nutrition, which was a huge thing for it, and exercise was as large as well. But when facing the Spanish flu, as everyone was terrified at that time, they relied not on drugs but on hydrotherapy. And this is what they say if you look at the red line here, and this tells you what happened. He says this: there were no drugs to be given, but with complete rest and quiet went a carefully regulated diet and fomentation applied to the throat, chest, and abdomen. So fomentations would be like a pack of cloths that they would put on the chest using different temperatures, hot and cold. And it says this treatment in almost every case reduced temperature of patients. And in a day or so, they were apparently well. But that did not end the matter with them. The next danger was the relapse. To guard against this, every patient was required to remain in bed from 2 to 5 days after full and apparent recovery, according to the state of their flu affliction. The result of this system of handling a disease that is scoring thousands of victims every day, there has not been one case that would have been called serious or a single death in the seminary, although there were more than 90 persons affected. The record is remarkable. It is the ordinary methods of dealing with flu appear irrational. That's fascinating. In other words, what were the ordinary methods? Strychnine, mercury, quinine, aspirin, uh, belladonna, digoxin, all these terrible drugs. Those appeared irrational to this author, and yet they were just putting different temperature cloths on the throat and chest and on the head to reduce temperature, give bed rest, and give a very simple diet. And they lost no one. They lost no one in the middle of the fight against the Spanish flu. That's what they did. This is the next slide you're going to see. This is published in a book all about hydrotherapy, and they actually show how they treated pneumonia back then. Now today, when we look at pneumonia, we go, well, you got to do IV antibiotics, you got to go to the hospital. This is how they treated it back then. And this was actually quite effective. It was called a cold water coil, and they would get cold water to circulate all the way through and drain out the middle. And you can see in the two buckets, one for draining and one for getting the cold water in. And that's how they would do it. And they would use that to stimulate the body's own system. What's interesting about cold water, particularly when it's applied to the chest, is it causes sympathetic nervous stimulation. And what that does is it tends to open up the bronchioles, tends to open up the breathing area without using drugs. It's quite impressive that they knew that. The other thing that the cold water coil does is after it's done, it stimulates a rush of the immune system to send white blood cells and everything into the lungs and chest cavity to fight. So that's what they did, and that's how they were actually treating it. Now, not necessarily in that seminary article, they were using fomentations, but in sanitariums and then different institutions, they were actually using the hydrotherapy coil. Now, in this next slide, this is from the Review and Herald. This is This is another Seventh-day Adventist publication, and they are actually talking about a doctor who was using hydrotherapy, and this is impressive. This is he talks about this in 1919, and so people were worried that the Spanish flu was going to come back, and this is what he says, and he's writing this to Seventh-day Adventists because, again, they believed in hydrotherapy. So he says this at the red line. He says, this influenza epidemic has given us as a people one of the greatest opportunities to gain the confidence of people that we've ever had. And yet, we have not improved it as we should. Here in the Southwest, where fads and quackery are so rife, many of our own people have failed to arise to the occasion as they should, and have leaned upon the broken reeds of osteopathy, medicines, etc., which in no way tend to give credit to God or to his rational methods. Here in this place where I am present, the success of hydrotherapy in influenza and pneumonia is the talk of the town. The family of the Baptist minister uses it. The wife of the Presbyterian minister, who was nursed by my wife, is now going about with a set of fomentation cloths treating influenza patients. 2 women from the Brethren Church have also done a valiant service with the credit given to hydrotherapy. It is distinctly recognized as an agent used by the Seventh-day Adventist physicians. Some even call me because I am a Seventh-day Adventist, not knowing me in any other way. It's fascinating. People would just call him because he was a Seventh-day Adventist. They didn't know he was even a doctor. He says this: the day will come soon enough when our rational methods will be powerless before the scourges of the last days. He's talking about the plagues. But until then, we should study to become more proficient at these methods and work as we have never worked before. Classes in simple hydrotherapy should be held in every church company. Both men and women should be taught to use these simple remedies as they can be used in all homes. He was using hydrotherapy, fomentation cloths, and they were finding success in this. It's amazing to think that they were fighting this plague, this flu that was killing millions of people, and they were just using fomentation cloths, and they were saving lives. Now, he's writing this to the Review and Herald because people were walking away from the health message. And he's saying, look, guys, this hydrotherapy thing works. Don't think because you're so afraid that we need to rely on medicines, we need to rely on the things of this world. We've been given insight into treating people, particularly with hydrotherapy. And you can see he's making this plea. As we look to the next slide, he says this. He says, this is a little off subject, but this is a little off the subject I began with, but nevertheless, it is certainly a part of preparation we should make. We need to press together, to work together, to harmonize our efforts. Let us lay aside our differences and divisions, improving to the utmost, very little time of unhindered labor, which has now left us. In other words, he's saying, look, guys, let's get together. Let's use hydrotherapy. Let's treat people. There are going to be plenty of people sick. Let's do this. Now, the editor writes back, and this is what the editor says in response to this letter, which was written into the Review and Herald. He says this: surely the time in which we live and the conditions in this great world constitute a clarion call to the Church of Christ to enlarged and in more earnest service. Every home today should be a sanitarium. Every Seventh-day Adventist a worker in some capacity for the Master. God has given to every man his work. He has entrusted some talent to every believer. Let us be careful that we do not seek to excuse ourselves with the argument that our ability is so small there is nothing we can do, and in this way fall under condemnation of the man with one talent. So he was even saying, look, just because things seem horrible and that you don't feel like you can do anything, don't count out natural remedies. Don't count out a knowledge of diet, exercise, and hydrotherapy. These things are remedies which heaven approves of. And that's what they believed. That's what Seventh-day Adventists taught and believed for many years, unfortunately, that many were beginning to walk away from this health message at that time. And so natural remedies were often left with just random practitioners and physicians, and sometimes were just simple mother's remedies. So one of the things that ends up happening because people were walking away from the health message is we find that people who weren't Seventh-day Adventists, who didn't understand the heavens view of using sunlight, exercise, diet, water, and simple things to treat disease. People who didn't understand that started to find that disease could be treated using simple means. As we look at the next slide, you can see here this was published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2009, and this is about the open air treatment of the Spanish flu. What's amazing about this author went through the archives and he studied, and he was so impressed. This is a researcher. This isn't someone who is trying to clear his chakra and do his ohms, or is wanting to get involved in some sort of spiritualistic or woo-woo medicine. This is a guy who is a researcher, and he was deeply impressed by what he found in the archives of history of how they were treating the Spanish flu. And if we go to the next slide, and this is what he talks about here. This is about Camp Brooks, and this is about the treatments that performed there. Now, Camp Brooks was a hospital that was situated just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, where they had all kinds of soldiers. And as you can see in the picture how they were treating, and this is what he says. He says, the treatment at Camp Brooks Hospital took place outdoors with a maximum of sunshine and fresh air day and night. The officer in charge was Major Thomas F. Harrington, had studied the history of his patients and found that the worst cases of pneumonia came from parts of ships that were badly ventilated. Now, what happened was that they would recognize that people who traveled on boats, they got very sick. As a matter of fact, the word quarantine comes from the word 40, and it was used to talk about when Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days. It talks about the idea of Jesus being in the mountain fasting for 40 days. And this was an idea of cleansing. And so quarantine was originally used as the dark ages of Europe. They began to become maritime powers. And so what they notice is that people, when they come back on these voyages, were deathly sick. Many of them from scurvy, some of them probably from pellagra, which were all diseases of nutrition, some with influenza, some with other tropical diseases like malaria. And so they noticed this, so they would force the boats to wait either in harbor or at some other location like a Lazar house for 40 days until they would let them in the city, because they didn't want people to get sick. And so studying this, Major Thomas F. Harrington looked at all of this, and he found that when the people on the boats, whether they're in the Navy or the mercantile class, he found that when they allowed soldiers to get plenty of fresh air, they actually recovered. That putting them down into the hole or into their bunks where they couldn't get fresh air, where they were saturated by other seamen and other crew members who were sick, that they didn't recover. They got sicker and sicker and sicker, particularly because they were vomiting, and their waste and their refuse was all over inside the hull, and it wasn't very clean. But when they laid them out on the top of the boat where they got sunlight, fresh air, and water, they recovered. So looking at that, Major Thomas F. Harrington at Camp Brooks decided that, hey, we're going to put these soldiers who are sick with pneumonia outside. And so he goes on to say, he says, in good weather, patients were taken out of their tents and put in the open. As you can see in the picture, there they are in the open getting sunlight. They were kept warm in their beds at night with hot water bottles and with extra blankets, and were fed every few hours throughout the course of fever. And he goes on to the next. So notice this. That's how they did it. They realized that their drugs weren't working, their vaccines weren't working, and they said, hey, let's put people outdoors, let them breathe fresh air, let them get sunlight, and they'll recover. And they did. This was during the Spanish flu, which killed millions of people. That's what they were doing. And this, again, this was a major in the U.S. military who was figuring this out, treating these people. He goes on. This is what the author says, researching this. He says, the patients at Camp Brooks recovered in direct sunlight when available. This may have, so he says, this direct sunlight hitting their chests, helping them. This may have kept infection rates down, because laboratory experiments have shown ultraviolet radiation inactivates influenza virus and other pathogens, and sunlight kills bacteria. This is fascinating, because there was a company This is crazy. I have to bring this up now, but there was a company that invented a medical device that took UV lights, brought it all the way down into the trachea, into the airways, into the lungs, and these UV lights would go in there and they would shine, and it was to eliminate viruses and bacterial and help with pneumonia. Sadly, what happened is that the United States President Donald Trump had mentioned something about shining a light in there. And unfortunately, the press was so angry that he would talk about the ability of UV lights to treat viruses, particularly SARS-CoV-2, that the video of this medical device company, which was originally on YouTube, was taken down. Now you can find it at the regular site, but they had made this medical device where they were treating pathogens using ultraviolet lights. Now, here in this article, this 2009 article, this researcher is guessing that this is why the fresh air treatment worked. Imagine that. Sunlight, UV light becomes political when you have a virus that all we can focus on treating it is this narrow window. Drugs and vaccines, drugs and vaccines. That's all we can do. And of course, lockdowns, taking away people's freedoms. Those are the only things we can do. But here we are talking about the history, and we're looking at the treatment at Camp Brooks, and they're using open air, fresh air, and sunlight. And it is a well-known fact that UV light does indeed kill bacteria and viruses. But they go on. Let's get back to it. He says this: one advantage of placing patients outside in the sun is that they can synthesize vitamin D in their skin, which they cannot do indoors behind glass. Rickets, the classic childhood deficiency of the classic disease of vitamin D deficiency, has long been associated with respiratory infections. It has been hypothesized that low levels of vitamin D may increase susceptibility to influenza. So not only does the UV light kill bacteria and viruses, but the body making vitamin D also protects from viruses as well, which is a long-standing. There's lots of literature, lots of medical literature talking about the ability of vitamin D to inactivate viruses, particularly influenza, and probably the corona class of viruses as well. I haven't read anything yet on SARS-CoV-2. There was a study that they published where they said vitamin D was not effective, and I think it was in the Journal of American Medical Association, but don't quote me on that. But anyways, they said it wasn't effective. Well, it turns out that in that study they were only using 400 international units, or 400 IUs of vitamin D to supplement with these people with the coronavirus. Well, a physiological dose, in other words, a dose that actually changes your physiology, that helps you, is estimated to be about 4,000 to 5,000 IUs. So if they were giving you a low dose of 400 IUs, it was almost as they were giving you nothing. So of course that wouldn't work. There is a group of physicians that get together. They're called the Vitamin D Council, and they actually talk about taking 5,000 IUs daily to just keep your body at level. And part of the reason why they say that is so many people work indoors. We don't work outside. And even in places where you get plenty of sunlight, people aren't outside very much. So very important to think about. But consider this, that by simply just putting people out in the sun, letting UV light kill viruses and disease and bacteria and all those other things, and building vitamin D, they were hardening the defenses. They were helping these soldiers recover. It's quite amazing as we go back to it. And this is what he says. And this is one of the pull quotes. He says, as few medicines were used to relieve the patient's symptoms and aid their recovery, but these were considered less important than regular meals, warmth, and plenty of fresh air and sunlight. So they even reduced medicine. So people were thinking, oh, maybe they used drugs. No, they tried to use as little as possible because they recognized that it wasn't working. Let's go to the next one. So he goes on. This is what he says. Many doctors felt that patients would get the same benefits if the windows of if a conventional ward were open or the patients put in a hospital sun parlor. Camp Brooks, however, held that patients did not do as well in ordinary hospital no matter how well ventilated. as they did outdoors. Patients in indoor sun parlors were not exposed to direct sunlight all day as they were outdoors. He reported that in one general hospital, at 76 cases, 20 patients died within 3 days and 17 nurses fell ill. By contrast, according to one estimate, the regimen adopted at the camp reduced the fatality of hospital cases from 40% to 13%. So this was fascinating that in the Spanish flu, it wasn't just the people who got sick, it was also the people administering care. They got sick. There was one famous story of a nurse who started off her shift fine, and by the end of the shift, she died of the Spanish flu. And so over and over again, the people were terrified that they themselves would get sick from the Spanish flu. And what was amazing is that not only were their lives saved, but also those that they were treating. So the Camp Brooks concept of putting people out in the open air was so effective that it saved the lives of the people with the disease and the people administering treatment. That's impressive. That's impressive. And you look here in the two pictures, you can see the comparison between Walter Reed, where they have a sun parlor and the nurse is there covered, and then you see Camp Brooks, where the physician is wearing his mask, the nurse has her mask pulled down for the photo, but apparently she felt pretty safe. I'm not sure how much those masks would have done to actually prevent the Spanish flu, because remember, they didn't even have an understanding of just how small a virus was in those days. And so think about it. They were using this method, saving lives, and yet Walter Reed, the hospital in the bottom of the picture, as you can see, said, hey, we'll do the same thing, but they couldn't even get the same results. Sadly, that would have been reported in today's literature as they tried to do the natural method and it didn't work, whereas they didn't do the method right, which actually did work. So this is a very impressive part of history, which we can see that simple sunlight, fresh air, was able to stave off the fatality of a worldwide pandemic. And yet, you don't hear anything about that. As a matter of fact, it's just the simple, narrow perspective. We need a new vaccine. A vaccine, by the way, which is highly experimental. There's reports that we've never made a successful messenger RNA vaccine, and we need these experimental drugs, which are quite costly. This is the only window of treatment that we can think of. People would probably lose their mind if we said, hey, let's take people sick with SARS-CoV-2 and put them outside and let them get fresh air and sunlight. Or try that medical device that went through the trachea and pumped in UV light in the lungs. We know that that's controversial. Let's go to the next slide here. So this is what he concludes. And this is a very fair conclusion. Mind you, these are two researchers who've been looking at it. They're publishing the American Journal of Public Health. And they said, however, more might be gained by introducing high levels of natural ventilation, or indeed by encouraging the public to spend as much time outdoors as possible. It might also be prudent to stockpile tents and beds, because hospitals in the United Kingdom and the United States and elsewhere are not prepared for a severe pandemic. Temporary accommodation would be required to deal with the most seriously ill, just as it was in 1918. The Camp Brooks Open Air Hospital might serve as a useful model. Fascinating. Now, what's interesting about this is that we didn't have, at least in the United States, we didn't have hospitals overrun. We did not have that. The terrible numbers that they were predicting with the pandemic never panned out the way that they said that they would. So it is interesting to think that what would have happened had we tried to encourage our hospitals and our staff to put patients who were sick outdoors, wheel them outdoors, let them get as much sunlight as possible. What would have happened if we had done that? Would people have gotten well? We don't know. Unfortunately, we're unwilling to do any of that. We're terrified out of our minds, and we're actually experiencing a lot of fear because of it. And yet, history shows us with a pandemic that was far worse, people were getting better with hydrotherapy, fresh air, sunlight, water, and simple meals. perhaps we can take the advice of that doctor not to give in to panic and maybe believe that there are still some good old-fashioned wisdom and natural remedies. We're going to wrap it up there. We have much more to talk about in this slide, much more to talk about in future presentations, and I hope you all are blessed by this. We have more to say. In the next one, we'll be talking about modern therapeutics using natural remedies because, as I alluded to, there is literature that actually is published, peer-reviewed, that talks about using some things that are within reach of everyone that can treat viruses, particularly SARS. SARS, as you know, is called SARS-CoV-2 because there was a SARS virus before. There was also MERS. These are all coronaviruses. And so we have at least some scientific understanding of things that could possibly work. But this we will talk about in another presentation. For now, I will leave you with what we have. And again, history does not always repeat itself. Sometimes it just rhymes. God bless you all. Thank you.